Okay, so today is our last lecture. We're going to be looking at AutoCAD edit or modify type commands. I have that in your syllabus. Um, and what we're looking at here are the commands that you're going to be looking at. Now, I'm not going to be doing all of those. A few that I'm not going to do. I don't think we're going to take a look at stretch, and probably not p-edit and explode. And obviously in CAD, there's a lot more types of commands that are available. So we're just getting into the majority of the edits. Last week, of course, we introduced layering. So you have a pretty good concept of CAD over the last 5 weeks. And this will be having us getting into our last assignment, which I'll be going over with you guys on Wednesday. So ideally, it would be great to have everything finished by Wednesday, but that's obviously not going to happen. So don't worry about that. If you don't have everything completed, you'll have time to work on those. But I will say this, is that once you migrate into the GIS portion, that's going to take you some time. So you want to try to get as much done as you can. Ideally, it would be nice to have assignment 4 done by Wednesday, and then you would just have that one outstanding to complete. Also, as you migrate into the GIS portion with Amy next Monday, make sure that you have your book because you're going to need that. You won't be able to do anything without that book. So I do believe they have it at the bookstore. Probably can get it from Amazon, but make sure that you're set up and ready to go. So we're going to take a look at, we're going to continue on with the modify commands, extend, lengthen, trim, break, join. Those are all going to do kind of similar things. And then we'll take a look at rotate, scale, and align, and those are kind of similar in the way they work. Then we'll take a look at arrays, and that'll probably maybe explode also. I'll show you that one, which I kind of already have, and then that should take care of that. So let's jump into AutoCAD and take a look at it. So I'm going to just open up a brand new drawing. So all of the commands that we're looking at today are going to be found in this area right here. These are all the modify sections. So we've already taken a look at move, copy, and we've taken a look at fillet. Those are very, very powerful commands. You can do a lot of the same things that we're going to talk about with some of these that we've already looked at. Erase. See, I don't think we've taken too many in here. So there's some other ones buried under here as well. So we're going to start out with extend and then move into trim. Extend and trim are somewhat what I would call inverses of each other. And in fact, they're actually the same command in the way they work. So let me jump over to my little picture here and just show you when we talk about the extend command. So the extend command requires 2 objects as a minimum to make it work. So you have to have, well, let's say a line like this, and then another line or anything like that. So it doesn't have to be just lines, by the way. I mean, anything that has endpoints will extend. So what you have in this command, you have 2 objects. The first one is called the boundary edge. And that's what you select first. And most people kind of do it reverse, and then the command doesn't work. But you always select the boundary edge first. And then you select the object to extend. And that's the thing that goes second. And again, a lot of people want to start in, they start selecting what they want to extend first, and it doesn't work. Now, anything can be a boundary edge. So you could actually have both of these guys as boundary edges. But once you select your boundary edge or edges, then you hit enter, and then it's going to ask you to select objects to extend, and then basically this will just go in like that. Now, if you have an object like this, it technically doesn't have a boundary edge out here, so it may or may not extend. It depends on what your setting is. But mathematically, as long as these guys are not parallel, this guy would extend out to where the extension would be. So this is a really powerful command. So let's take a look at this. So in order to do this, I'm just going to go ahead and draw something very similar to what I had. So I'm going to do it just a little bit differently. I'm going to draw a couple of different types of objects to kind of show you how this will work. And so what I'm going to have here is I've got a line that I started with here. Okay, there's an endpoint line. You can do like P lines. I'm going to do an arc just to kind of show you how an arc will extend. And I'm going to do another line that's going to come in like this. And I want you to notice specifically as I do this, how this thing is really not hitting this. So extend, we find that up here. It might say trim. These guys are kind of buried under each other. So if I start out with trim, then that's the one that's there. What I'm going to do is go to extend, or I could use its alias, which is actually EX. So if you'll notice down here, and this is the tricky part, it says select the boundary edges. And so what I would do is if I want to extend these guys to this line, I'm going to select this as my boundary edge. Now keep in mind, as what I just said before, is that I can use anything as a boundary edge. Okay, everything in your drawing can be a boundary edge, and I'll show you that little trick here. But once I've selected boundary edges, then I just hit enter, and then it's just a matter of saying, okay, what do you want to extend? That one will extend. This one will extend. Now I want you to notice this one won't extend, and the reason is because if this extended, this would make an arc, a 360-degree arc. In other words, you would turn an arc into a circle, and AutoCAD will not let you do that. So in this case, this one won't extend. But notice if I undo that extension that I just did, I could extend it on this side. So you do have this kind of cool undo in here if you want to. So now let's see what happens when we try to extend this. Okay, so that one did extend. And if you're trying this at home, it may not extend. So I want to show you why that's extending. In the extend command, there is a sub option called project, or I'm sorry, edge. So if you go to the edge mode, notice that you have what's called extend and no extend. If you have no extend turned on, which is I think the normal setting, those kind of things won't extend. So for instance, in this case, if I tried to extend this guy, well, let's see, let me draw another line here. Actually, I'm just going to move this guy. Because I turned that extend off, notice that when I try to extend it now, boundary edge, and then hit that, notice it tells me there's no boundary. But if I go to edge and turn the edge mode to extend, it'll now let me do it. Okay, so that's a little toggle, and that will affect both trims and extends. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. All right, Dan, you just joined. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I think it's just you and me, by the way. So if there's any questions, let me know.
Sure thing.
Okay, so extend is pretty simple. Now, remember, we can use the fillet to do an extend, but this is, if you've got a lot of extensions to do, this one's going to be the better way to go. Okay. So a subset, or kind of the inverse of extend, would be to cut things, or what we call trim. So let me go back over to my picture here and show you. In this case, I'm going to just clean this up. Just generate a real new file real quick. So in this case, what you have, when you do a trim, you have to have, again, a minimum of 2 objects, and you have to have one that physically crosses like that, or it could cross like this. So again, that trim or extend no extend will work with this guy as well. So for trimming, it works kind of the same way we just talked about. You have to select what's called a cutting edge first. So if I'm going to trim with this, I would use a cutting edge, and I have to select that first. And you can have multiple cutting edges, so you don't need just one. But the bottom line is you have to select the cutting edge first. So if I'm selecting this as my cutting edge, then I can select the object to trim secondarily. And in this case, what you select is what's going to trim. So if I would select this object here, it's going to erase this out like this, okay? If you reverse that, if you select it down here, then it'll get that. So that's reverse to the way fillet works, because fillet will retain what you select, and trim will delete what you select. Now in this case, if your edge mode is turned on, like I have now, it'll mathematically project this guy out, kind of like this, and it would allow you to trim it either this side or that side of it. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing as the extend. You have to select your cutting edge first, your objects to trim second. Let's go back here and take a look at it. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just take this guy and I'm just going to move him kind of like this. So what we'll see now, if I'm going to cut with this, now remember, extend and trim are in the same bar, in the same area. So if I just open this up and go to trim, notice select cutting edges. So I'm going to select those first. Once I'm done selecting cutting edges, I just hit enter, and then you select what you want to trim. So I could trim that, and I can trim that as long as my extend is on. I can trim that side, but once I've trimmed one side, I can't trim the other. So if I don't want that one, I can undo it and come over here. I can come here and do that. Okay, and you can, when you're done, you just hit escape or you just hit enter, and that'll terminate it. So trim and extend, they're both really good commands. So what's really cool, let me just undo what I just did here, and I just want to show you that you can actually start out and trim and then go into extend. It just depends on how you do it. And here's the other thing that you can do too, which is really awesome. You can actually select every object as a boundary edge or a cutting edge, and then you have the flexibility of doing things real easily. So I'm going to start out and trim, and it's asking me to select cutting edges, and I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to hit enter. Now what that has done is selected everything as a cutting edge. So watch what happens. When I select this, it cuts. When I select that, it cuts. When I select that, it cuts. Now, this is really cool. If you hold the shift key down, you're now in an extend mode. So if I hold the shift key down and now select that, now it's extending. It's extending. It's extending. I'm holding the shift key. And what I'm going to now do is release the shift key. Now I'm back into trim. So I can trim, shift, extend, release it, it trims. Okay, so it goes back and forth. And the same thing works if you are in the extend command and you hold the shift key down when you select objects, it'll trim. So it goes back and forth. And remember that this little guy, this edge mode guy, once he's turned on to extend or no extend, he works, he stays on forever. So if you've turned it to no extend, it stays on, okay? And I think that's on by default. So if you're trying this, like I said, yours is probably set to no extend. So it's kind of nice to have it to this extend mode. All right, so we're going to move on then and take a look at another type of trimming, if you will. And this one is called the lengthen command. I think that's found down here. Yeah, right there. Okay, and the alias on this is len. Now this has 4 sub options, and so I'll show you how this works, but it's kind of neat. You can use it, even though it says lengthen, you can use it to trim if you do it right. So it just depends on how you use it. I'm going to clean my screen up here. Just let me erase all. Oops. Okay, and I'm just going to put one line down. Now, so one thing about the lengthen command, it only works with a single object at a time. So with the fillet command, you can only do 2 at a time, essentially 2 objects. With the trim command or the extend command, you can use multiple objects. But when the lengthen command, you can only use a single object at a time. So you can only use a pick box as a selection tool. So when I go into the lengthen command, and again, I can find it here, go here, or I can type in the word lengthen, or I can just type in len. you'll notice that we have 4 sub-options: delta, percent, total, and dynamic. So delta is allowing you to chop off pieces or increase pieces by a certain amount, a specified amount. So if you wanted to add a 1/4 inch to each end of this, you can do that by doing it delta. Or you can actually chop off a 1/4 inch by setting it to a negative delta distance. So if you have a positive delta distance, it adds or extends. If you have a negative delta distance, it subtracts. Percent does just what it says. If I say 50%, this thing's going to be half as big. 1/4, a 1/4 as big. Total is kind of cool because you can start out with any length line or object, and then it'll make it that exact amount. So I don't know what the length of this thing is, but if I want it to be exactly 1 inch, I can make it exactly 1 inch. And dynamic is a way of allowing you to drag it. Okay, so I don't use that one too much. I like to be a little bit more precise. So I'm going to start out here with delta. And notice it says either length or angle. So angle works if you have arcs. In this case, I don't. So it'll allow you to increase arc lengths based on an angled setting. So we're just going to use a length here, and I'm going to type in 1 unit. Okay, so because I don't know really how long this is. So the side that you touch on is the side that it's going to add to. So notice if I click it here, I add it. There's one. There's another. There's another. Now it's really not adding it, it's actually just pushing the endpoint out. So you'll notice if I come back to this, do it to the other side, when I get out of this command, when I click on it, notice you just have grip, grip, and grip. So it really didn't actually add pieces, it actually just moved that distance out. So if we try that again and we do that as a negative, what you can do is actually use this as a trim. So if I go into delta and I tell it -2, when I click on this side, notice what it's doing is it's chopping it off by units of 2 units at a time. And depending on what side you pick on is where it's going to chop it from. Okay, so that's your lengthen delta option. So if we use the lengthen percent, let's go into that real quick. I don't use that one too much, but percent, if I said percent and I want that to be twice as big, or let's say 50%, 50%. It's going to be half as big. Now watch, where I pick it, it's going to select, it's going to hold the opposite end fixed. So if I come here, notice it holds that end fixed, but what it's doing is it's dividing this in 2 and giving me that length right there. So one of my favorites is total, because what total allows you to do is have a length or an arc of any size, and what you're able to do then is tell it, well, I want this to be exactly 5 units. So right now I have no idea how long this is, no idea at all. But if I go into the lengthen command and I tell it total, I can say I want this thing to be exactly 5 units. And again, notice where I pick it, it holds it from the opposite end. So if I come this way, it goes the other way. But when I did that, and I list this, you'll notice that this is exactly now, if I list this, we'll see that that is exactly 5 units long to 14 sig figs. So that's a pretty neat one. In general, I probably use trim or extend more than I use lengthen, but the downside to using trim or extend is you have to have another object out here as a boundary or a cutting edge, and in this one you just need 1 object. In fact, you can only use 1 object. So that's kind of the difference. But in general, they do the same thing. So the next one we're going to take a look at is a command called break. And break is kind of a little bit hard to use. It again only works with 1 object. And you're best using probably O snaps when you use this. If you're not using O snaps, you're probably not going to get the results you want essentially. But break only trims, so that's the one thing. So lengthen can trim or extend, where break can only trim. And it's got some unique things about it, but basically it's going to require you to select 2 points to do the break. Okay, so when I do a break, and they have several breaks here, this is what they call, that's your normal break. And the alias, by the way, is BR. And this is what they call a break at a point. This isn't a true command. This is a macro command. So it really is using this command and doing a little bit with it. So I'm going to show you kind of how to do that. But if I choose the break, command. Ask you to select the object first. So wherever you select the object, it automatically uses that as the first point of the break, and then the second point you pick is going to be where it's going to break it. If you don't want that point to be the first point of break, then what you're going to do is choose first point, and you can pick another point then. Now, you don't have to actually be on the object, but if I use an O snap, for instance, I could go right to the middle, and then for the second point, I could snap to, let's say, the end point, and I could just break it off from middle to end like that. Okay, so O snaps are pretty important when you're using the break command. So for instance, in a circle, let me show you a circle type of break that you might do. And circles and arcs, you got to remember also, they're going to break counterclockwise from the first point to the second point. So if I chose a break option on this guy right here, I could select the circle, and notice that is the point. Notice how it's breaking counterclockwise. So what I could do here is say, no, I don't want that to be the first point. I want to force a first point at a quadrant point right there, and I want to break it to, let's say, the secondary quadrant point right here. And notice it did a nice break from the first quad point to the second quad point counterclockwise. So this allowed me to take a circle and turn it into an arc using the break command. But I can't. AutoCAD's kind of unique, and it will not let you turn an arc into a circle, but you can turn a circle into an arc. So there's your normal way of doing breaks. Okay. Again, probably would use trims a lot more often than I would use this. Now, there is one really cool thing about break that you can't do any other way in AutoCAD, and that is to break an object directly at a unique point, like say the middle of this line. I could break it right in the middle. And I can do that. When I do that, it doesn't take a piece out between those. Those guys are going to be broken in such a way that they're going to still be touching. So they're going to be touching endpoint to endpoint. There's really no other way to do this in AutoCAD, but this is really neat. So you can use this option. I kind of sometimes don't use it right, but this guy right here, this is called break at point. You can use that. What you do is you select your object, and then you can tell it the first point, specify first point of break, and that would be, I'm going to say midpoint, and then that's done. So what it did is notice it broke that thing right in the middle. And these guys are touching endpoint to endpoint. Now, if you do it manually using the normal break, here's what you would do. If you just use the normal break, you select your object, and then you tell it the first point. So I'm going to force that. I'm going to force that, let's say, at a quad point, at a quadrant point. And then what you have to, the trick is what you have to do is make the first point and the second point equal. So I could do another O snap quad, or all you have to do is hit the shift and the at symbol. All you need to do is do the at symbol, because that means last point. So it recognizes the last point. You just hit enter. And what it did is, it doesn't look like it did anything, but it broke that guy at the quad points. And again, those guys are sitting at complete endpoint to endpoints. They're touching. So there is, again, no other way to do that in AutoCAD other than using that break at command. So again, you can either do it manually yourself, or you can use this option, which is kind of a little macro that does that for you. Okay. All right. So any questions since we're sitting here? You got any questions? All right, guess we'll move on. So we talked about extend, we talked about trim, we talked about lengthen, and we talked about break. So those are all very similar commands, okay? Just remember, with trim and extend, you can use multiple objects. In fact, you have to have a minimum of 2, a cutting edge and an object to cut, or a boundary edge and an object to extend. Or you can use lengthen and break to kind of do the same thing, but you can only choose one object at a time. So it's a lot more limiting, but you have some control on what you're doing. So those are the things. All right, so now we're going to take a look at one that's called join. And join allows you to bring objects together as long as they are touching. Okay, so I want to show you what I mean by touching. So if this guy, let's say, this guy is touching endpoint to endpoint, these guys will join, and these guys will join, but these guys will not because they're not, even though they're crossing, they're not touching. So join also does another thing, is when you join objects, it turns them into polylines. And so once you turn them into polylines, then you have the ability to do width and those kind of things that polylines give you. So join is just easily found by typing in join or typing in J. That's probably the easiest place to find it. I think it's that one right there. Yeah, that's join. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select an object, okay? And then I'm going to select a second object, and I'm going to hit enter. So again, nothing looks like it happened, but it does tell me that two arcs were joined into one arc. So if I look at this guy, it tells me actually it didn't turn that into a polyline. So sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I guess it doesn't in this case. So it just turned it into an arc. Now, if it joins these two together, it would probably turn them into polylines. So let's try the join here. I'm going to join these guys. And let's see, that did turn that into a polyline. So notice before that was two lines and now it's a polyline. So now if I try to join these two objects together, that and that, it won't let me because they're not touching endpoint to endpoint. So they specifically have to be endpoint to endpoint. So watch, if I try to join this guy to this and hit enter, it'll tell me 0 objects joined, okay, because they're not touching. Now, if I selected this grip and moved him so that they're explicitly endpoint to endpoint, they should join now. Notice they're not joined currently. Okay, they're two separate objects. But if I go into the join command, I can select that, and they should join together. Now they're all one object, and they are definitely a polyline now. Okay? And again, once you have a polyline, then you can do things like give it width, and you can do other polyline edits to it. So it's kind of nice. People like to do that. But I use join. Join's a nice little command, so it's taking those things and bringing them together. And typically they're going to be, a polyline is going to be the result. Now, the inverse of a join would be to explode it. So explode would be taking a polyline or other types of objects. It doesn't only work with polylines, but it works with other types of objects, such as some types of what we call hatch patterns and things that we're not going to get into. But there are other things that you can explode. But in this case, if I select this guy and hit enter, it's now a line and a line and an arc. Okay, so it brought it down, and notice it didn't separate this into two arcs. It just left that as one arc. So, so again, you can join them or you can explode them. So those are kind of the reverses of each other. All right, we're moving right along. Actually, we're going to be done really, really early here, so that's good. And then you guys will be able to watch this and get this done before Wednesday. So I want to take a look at the rotate, scale, and then ultimately the align command. And these are going to be somewhat related as well, in kind of how they work. And we're going to see that. So in order to do the rotate, I'm going to show you the rotate first. I'm going to just draw a little object, and if you're drawing along with me or following along and you want to draw it, you can do the same thing. What I'm going to do is just draw like a little flag here, and I'm going to make that flag, I'm going to make that the shaft of my flag, and I'm going to bring that flag down like this, and then I'm going to snap what's called nearest O snap. I'm just going to make it kind of look like that. So it's kind of like a flag you would use in golf for the pin there. I'm going to go ahead and have that. So what we have the ability to do then is rotate objects, and rotation is somewhat tricky. So let me just go over here real quick and we'll talk about that. So I'm going to just get a new drawing here. So when you rotate objects, and it doesn't matter, you can rotate just one object, you can rotate multiple objects, you can rotate your whole drawing. And I will tell you this, as a mapper and doing some of the mapping applications that I do, rotating the whole drawing is sometimes something that you do or get into. So that's a really important function. But based on what we just showed here, let's say I'm going to draw something very similar to this. I've got this, and then I've got this. So there's my little flag. So when I rotate this thing, okay, what I'm going to do first is select the objects that I want to rotate. So in this case, I would select those 3 or 4 objects. After you hit enter, then it's going to ask you for a base point. Now, the base point can be literally anywhere, but think of this as like you're sticking a pin at this point, and that's going to be the point of rotation. So when I ask for a base point, I might, let's say, choose that point. But a lot of times what I'm going to do is do a base point that is on the object. And if that's the case, I want to make sure I use a no snap. So you're going to have one base point. So you select objects first, then you select your base point. So then you have a couple of options. And one is to provide it the angle of rotation. So here's the only thing you need to remember. If I want to rotate it this way, this is a positive rotation. If I want to rotate the object this way, this would be a negative rotation, because what we're dealing with is right-hand rule. And we're actually, are rotating this object in the XY plane, and we are rotating it about the Z axis. So you don't really have to know that, but this is actually my XY plane, and the Z axis is coming out of the middle of the base point. That's what's happening there. And again, from right-hand rule, when we're rotating this way, this is positive, this is negative, unless you've reversed that in your units. So this is, as long as you know what the exact number is. So for instance, if you want to rotate this exactly, let's say 32.56 degrees, you're in business. But if you don't know that, and if you're out, let's say you just type in 32 degrees and it's really something else, you could have a major rotation error. So that's why it's really, really critical when you do this that you know that angle and that you know that that's the angle that you need. So the other option is what's called a reference option. And in the reference option, what you're going to do is you're going to pick 2 points, a base point and a secondary point, essentially. And what it's going to do is it's going to reference this line. In other words, AutoCAD's going to measure what that angle currently is with respect to X. And then you're just going to tell it, oh, let's say I want it to be 90 degrees with respect to X, and it'll calculate this angle for you. Okay, so you can use the reference option, or you can use the turned angle option. Both of them are useful, but if you're going to use the angle option, you better know what the angle is. That's the bottom line. And if you're going to use the reference option, you better know how to do it. So let's take a look at this. This command can be dangerous because of that. So we find rotate. It's right next to move. It also has an alias of RO, rotate. So it's quite easy to find. If you select that, what it's going to do is ask you to select your objects first. So you can use any of your common, like, crossings, windows, those kind of things, but make sure that you're getting everything that you want to rotate, because it's real easy to leave something behind. And if you leave something behind or pieces behind, and then you rotate the majority of your drawing and you don't catch it for, like, let's say 2 days later, you could have a real mess trying to fix it. And a lot of times, like I said, in mapping, you may end up wanting to rotate your whole drawing. So that's where you might want to use a selection tool of all to make sure that you get everything. So those are all things you have to watch. But once I am done selecting my objects, I just hit enter, and then it's going to ask me to specify a base point. So again, a base point could be here, it could be here, it could be anywhere. But specifically, that's where the rotation's occurring. So a lot of times it's going to be on the object. So again, I'm going to use an O snap and make sure I'm snapping right to that point. So at this point now, I'm in what's called a drag mode, and you can see as I drag it to this way, that's a positive rotation. And if I drag it this way, it's a negative rotation. Now, I could just drag it and eyeball it. That's a rotation by eyeball. But notice, I wouldn't really want to do that because I want to be fairly specific. But again, I don't know what this angle was when I drew it. So let's type in 32 degrees. I'm going to go positive. And notice 32 degrees, it just added 32 degrees to whatever the shaft direction was initially. So there it is, it rotated it. So you don't have a lot of control if you're not careful, and in particular, like in our case, if we didn't reference it right. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to do this again and just show you if I go with a negative direction. So I'm going to base point it, Again, I'm going to use the base point. I'm going to show you what a midpoint base point rotation. Notice how it rotates now. But I'm going to do a negative 32 degrees, and you'll notice, let's see how that works. So it's positive, negative rotations. Okay. So let's say we want this thing to stand straight up and down, vertical. So in order to do that, I would need to know what this angle is, and the difference between this would be 90 degrees straight up. So I would need to know what that angle is minus 90 and rotate it by that amount. And I have no clue what that is. Now there's ways to list it, but if you don't get the whole number, you got to remember you're working in 14 sig figs. So just to show you, if I listed this angle right here, you'll notice it tells me that that angle is 20 degrees. But that's not actually 20 degrees because this is only set to display to the nearest degree. So if I type in 20 degrees, it's going to be close to 90, or type in 80 degrees as my rotation angle, it's going to be close to 90, but it's not, or not 80. I'm sorry, 70. It's going to be close to 90, but not exactly 90. So you're better off doing what's called a reference. So when I do this, what I'm going to do is have AutoCAD measure the angle on this to 14 sig figs and then tell it that I want it to be 90 degrees using a reference option. Okay, so this is a little tricky. Let's go through it. I'm going to do the rotate, again, just like normal. I'm going to select my objects to rotate. When I'm done selecting my objects, I just hit enter. I'm going to select the base point. I'm going to go ahead and put my base point here. And notice I'm in that normal mode where I'm just specifying a rotation angle. Well, what I'm going to now do is go to reference. And what I'm going to do is choose 2 points to reference. So I'm going to choose this point and this point. So you can do any 2 points along the shaft of that line. It really doesn't matter, but notice what it's done. Now it's picked that up. And it's asking me to specify the new angle. So the new angle is the angle that you want it to be with respect to X. So in this case, I want it to be straight up, and that would be 90 degrees. So I'm just going to type in 90, and it's exactly now 90 degrees straight up. So it calculated that difference for me and then rotated it based on what it needed to based on 14 sig figs. So that's pretty important. Okay, hopefully you got the idea of that. You probably do, I don't know, you don't do a ton of rotations, and when you do, usually you know the angle that you need to rotate things by. So, but I'm just, you got to be really careful because like I said, in my business, I do a lot of rotations, and particularly the types of rotations that I get into, they can be a mess. If you rotate things just off a couple of minutes, if you're off a couple of minutes or like 30 minutes, I mean, your whole project can be whacked out. And so that'd be a huge issue. So I want to show you something too. If you don't put your rotation angle on the object, how that rotation angle really affects it. I'm just going to undo this real quick. And I'm going to put my rotation instead of on the object. I just want to show you if I put it down here, notice how it rotates. It's rotating it based on where that point is down there, the base point. So you always have to be cognizant of the angle that you're rotating and where you are rotating it from. And again, probably 80% of the time, the rotation point is going to be on the object itself. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Okay, so we're going to now take a look at one called scale. And scale works really similar to rotation in the fact that you're going to select your object and you're going to give it a base point. So I've got my object, I'm going to give it a base point, and then you're going to give it a scale factor. Okay. And that scale factor could be 1, which would give you no change. So in other words, that's literally multiplying this object by 1, no change. If I'm greater than 1 or less than 1, it's going to make a difference, but it can't be less than 0. Okay, so if it's greater than 1, so if I'm greater than 1 or less than 1, greater than 1 is going to increase it, less than 1 is going to decrease it. So now here's the thing. The scale factor works from the base point. So if the base point is sitting in the middle of the flag, the increase or decrease is going to happen from that point. In fact, the coordinates of the base point don't change. all of the other coordinates on the points too. Okay. Also, if your base point is off the object, not only will your object increase or decrease, but the distance from the base point to the object will also increase or decrease. So what can happen in that case is that not only you're increasing or decreasing the size of the object, but you are also moving the object with respect. So in other words, all your coordinates will move based on that. So scale, the factor could be 1. If you have a scale factor of 1, you shouldn't even be doing a scale. That's kind of crazy. So you're going to be either greater than or less than. So this one is a really good tool when you're working with people that are working in different units. So for instance, if I drew a drawing, let's say inadvertently in inches and I really should have been in metric, what I can do is multiply it by the scale factor that I need to get it to a metric thing, which would be like 25.4 or 0.254, depending on whether you're going centimeters, millimeters, or whatever. So you can do those kind of things to get it there. Or like I've indicated, architects and engineers, a lot of times mappers and surveyors and civil engineers, we work in decimal units. We say 1 unit is 1 foot, when in reality it's 1 inch. Architects are going to be working in a real world unit. So in this case, I would scale up by 12 or down by 12. So I can do it either way. So we're going to show you how to do this. So we're going to take this guy and scaling. So scale is, let's see, where is that located? On the same column, but it's the bottom row here, scale. And the alias, by the way, is SC on this guy. So you can type in scale or SC or select it from the ribbon. Again, you select your objects first, then you hit enter, then you give it a base point so it looks a lot like rotate. And again, if you don't want the object to move, you need to pin it down with the base point being on it. So if that means those points right there, that point's not going to change. So notice as I drag it out from that, my scale factor is increasing greater than 1. Here it's getting less than 1. Okay. And this is just dragging it. So again, if I know my explicit scale factor, I just type it in. So let's say I want to type in 2. Notice it gets twice as big. What you should notice is that this point didn't move. All of the other coordinates did, but the base point didn't. So that's true of any point. If I select it, let's just kind of show you that. If I select a different point, if I select that as my base point, notice that's the point that's not going to move. So if I type in, let's say 0.5, okay, that point didn't move. Now, watch what happens when I go into scale. And I select my objects and I give it my base point here. What's going to happen is notice as I increase the scale factor, not only is the object getting bigger, but it's also getting further away from my base point because the distance from the base point to the object is also scaling. So it can go both ways. I can descale it, increase it, decrease it. Okay. So if I type in 2, notice what happens. So all of the coordinates on that point displace at that point. All right, so let's say we need to scale this object, but we don't know by how much, but we do know that this piece right here has to be exactly 5 inches. So I can use a reference scale, just like I can a reference rotation. So I'm going to go into the scale command, select my objects, give it a base point, and this time I'm going to reference it. So I'm going to reference it from that point to that point because what I want to be is I want that shaft to be exactly 5 units. So I don't know what my scale factor is to make that happen, but I do know that I want it 5. So now since it's referenced, all I have to do is say 5 units. Now notice what it did is it decreased it. And if I list that shaft, you'll notice that is exactly 5 units long to 14 sig figs. So that one is really, really useful. Okay, really useful. The other thing is if you have a number that wouldn't be a very nice number, like say 12, if you divide 1 by 12, you're not going to get a very nice number. So what you want to do is let AutoCAD do your math for you. So for instance, if I want to scale this down by 1/12, I'm not going to take and key 1 and divide it by 12 on my calculator because it's going to float out forever. But if I do this on AutoCAD, what I can do is I can say, okay, scale this. Here's your base point. And I want you to scale it by 112. So you type 1/12. And what it did is it did the math for me. So it floated it out 14 sig figs. That's a much better way of doing it, especially if you have a fractional number that's not going to be a great fractional number. Okay, so that's the scale command. So scale and rotate are very similar in how they work. So the next one we're going to look at is called the align command. And the align is a really cool command. You might recall when we talked about the move command, we said that what it does is it moves objects in such a way that they don't rotate. That's called a translation. What the align command is going to do is do three things in one. So the align command will allow you to do, oops, come on. The align command is what's called a transformation. And the align equals a move plus a rotate plus a scale all in one command. And when you rotate, move, and scale, that's called a transformation. So this is a really, really cool command, and it really keeps you from doing a lot of work because it kind of does all your work, provided that you know how to use O-snaps. Okay, so O-snaps are the key when you're using this guy. So let's just go back here. We're going to show you a really neat little thing. So again, if you're following along with me, go ahead and just clean your screen up. I'm going to do a zoom extents to bring it back to a normal view. So I'm going to draw a line over in this corner, and I'm going to not worry about the size of that line, and I don't know what that angle is on that line. Okay, but I'm also going to come over here and I'm going to do a rectangle, and I want that rectangle to sit on that inclined line so that the point there is going to be at the midpoint of that, and I want it rotated perfectly with that line. Now, you could do that right now using a move command, and then you could figure out it using a rotate command, but that would be two commands that you would have to do in one, and getting the rotate would probably be the hard part. If we use the align command, we can do this in one fell swoop, again, as long as we select things properly. So the align command didn't used to be on the menu. They finally put it in here. It's buried. It's right here. It's one of the best commands, that, particularly for mapping. This is a great command. But what this allows me to do is just go into the align. So what we're going to do is select the objects we want to align. So I don't want to align both of these. I mean, I might have multiple objects, but in this case, I just want to align the rectangle to the line. So what I'm going to do is select that and then hit enter. So now it's going to ask me to specify a first source point. So that's some unique point on this guy. So what I'm going to do is use an O-snap end, and that's going to be my start point, and that point's going to go to this point. So notice what it's doing is it's going to take it from that, and what it's drawing is what's called a displacement vector. So what you're seeing is that amount, basically it's using that to calculate the distance of move and the rotation. So then it wants to know a second source point. So second source point is going to be on my initial object. And I can take that anywhere on this line I want as long as it's somewhat separated. So I'm going to put it right here. All right. Now it's coming back and it's asking me for a third source point. And the reason is because this can be used for 3D applications. So this rectangle could actually be sitting not only the way it is, but it could also be above the line that we can't see. And if we want to get it down on the line, we would need a third source point. So we don't have a third source point because we're doing what's called a 2D transformation. So we're just going to hit enter. So at this point it's saying, okay, do you want to scale the objects based on the alignment points? So this would be the third thing. So the first two things are going to be a move and a rotate. And if I say yes to scale it, what will happen is it'll make this size right here equal to what that is. So it looks like they're pretty close, but it's either going to increase it or decrease it. I'm going to say no, but I want you to watch what happens when I say no and hit enter. It's going to do a move first and then a rotate second. It's going to do it pretty quick. Okay, ready? Go. So notice what it did is it moved it and then it rotated it, and it didn't scale it, and I'll show you why. You notice the end point of the line is not coincident with the endpoint of the rectangle, so it didn't scale it. So just to show you, if we did scale it, if I did happen to scale that, I would select that guy first. Again, I'm going to base point to secondary point. Okay, displacement vector of the second to the end. And this time, I'm going to say yes. And notice now the endpoint of that line and the endpoint of the rectangle coincide because it also did a scale. So you don't always do a scale, but it'll always do a move and a rotate for you. So that's a super command. It's especially if you're doing particularly three-dimensional stuff, you can really get three-dimensional stuff way whacked out, and then it's kind of hard to deal with. All right, so we have one more command to deal with, and actually there's several subsets of this. There's a rectangular, a polar, and a path array. So let's take a look at this. I'll explain that. So we're going to look at the command called array. And what an array is going to give you a pattern of objects based on a unique starting object. So you have what's called a rectangular array. You have what's called a polar array. And those are the two that we're going to be using on this fifth assignment. And there's one that's called a path array. We're not going to use this, but I think I'll show you. It's kind of cool. So rectangular array, you're going to start out with one object and you're going to array it in columns and rows. So much like bricks would be on a wall, or ceiling tiles, or ceiling, or floor tiles on a floor. What you're going to start out with one object like this, and you're going to give it this and this, and what you're going to wind up with is objects that are going to be coming out like this. So these guys, these are your, this is your row direction, and these are called columns. And what you have then is also a distance between rows. This would be your distance between rows, and this would be your distance between columns. And because you've got columns and rows, they can go this direction, or they can go this direction, or they could go this direction, or they could go that direction. So you could have 4 different quadrants that you could go into. And what determines that is whether your row distance and your column distance is negative or positive. So if your row distance is positive, they're going to shoot in this way. And if they go this, if their column distance is positive, it's going to go this way. Negative column distance would send your array this way, and positive row would be this way. So you kind of get the idea. So polar coordinates are going to, or polar arrays are going to be like the, you don't see these too many. These are very common rectangular arrays. Polar arrays are like what you see on the numbers on the face of a clock or on your watch. Those are, you start out with the number and then you array it around a circle. So you can kind of think it's based on a circle. And a path array is going to follow some kind of squiggly line. So you're going to have like this, and I kind of call it a string of pearls because that's kind of what it looks like. And these are going to array in a direction like that. So we'll take a look at these guys as we get into this. So we're going to start out with the rectangular array first. So your arrays are located here, and they're actually the same command, but they look like they're separate. So they have rectangular, path, and polar. So what we're going to do is start out with an object that we want to array first. So what I want to do, I want to draw a very specific rectangle, okay? Because you kind of have to know the size of this or it's not going to work very well, particularly if you're dealing with rectangular distances and the columns and rows. So I'm just going to pick a point. What I'm going to do is make sure that this thing is exactly 1 unit by 1 unit. So I'm just going to say at 1, 1. So what I've done is by picking that point first and then saying at 1, 1, it's going to make this side 1 and that side 1. So now that I know that, I'm going to just see, where is that? Yeah, I guess that's, I got that in negative space, but that doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to move it over. Okay, so there's my object. So we're going to go to this guy called a rectangular array. And what it first wants me to do is select the objects to array. Now you can have multiple objects. I'm just tending to use this guy right here. Once you hit enter, what you do is you automatically get an array, and what happens is you get this thing called an array creation tab. So this is called a context sensitive editing tab. And when you're done with the array, it will disappear. But notice it's already set to 4 columns and 3 rows. So notice there's 4 columns and 3 rows. And the distance is the distance, and the column is 1.5. So from here to here is 1 unit plus a half. So the total is 1.5, because you're always measuring the distance from the original point to the same point on the copy. So that's 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. And notice the rows are also 1.5, and they're both positive, so they're both going up. So you can change that. Like for instance, if I wanted to say, I want the number of rows to be 5, I just come in here and make this 5. This is really a cool tool. I just come in here and make that 5. And I'm going to make this, let's say 10. Sometimes it takes it a minute to do it. And then you would change the distance. So if I want the column distance to be, instead of 1.5, well, for instance, if I would make them 1, they're going to be sitting right on top of each other. So I'm going to make these 1.25. And I'm going to make these guys 2. Okay, so once you get this, what's really cool, you just go ahead and close that. This now becomes an object. So this is called an array object. So if you click on this, notice this is an array object. And the cool thing is once you've got it like this, you can edit it really rapidly. So notice it took me right back into that dialog box, and I can say, oh, I really wanted my rows to be 5 and my columns 10. So I can come in here and just swap them and make these 5. And it's that easy to do. And maybe I want to bounce that down to 1.5. So I can do that. And once I got that, I got my array. So there's your array, and it's pretty simple. Now, there's not a lot of edits you can do with that array other than that type of editing. You can't come in here, for instance, I cannot take a line in here, bring it across like this and trim it. If I try to trim it, notice if I try to trim that, my boundary, it's not going to let me do that. Okay, so there are some downsides to that. But if you leave it as an array, then you, number one, you make that one object. Instead of 50 objects, it's just one object right now. So you do have some functionality with that. If you don't want that to be an array, though, what you can do is you can just click on him and you can explode him. Let's see, do this. I'm going to go to explode and select that. Once I do that, I've killed the array. It's no longer an array. So notice each one of these now is a separate object. Okay. So you can think of a lot of, if you look around, you know, the world and you see things, there's a lot of things that are array patterns. And this is just a quick way of producing it. And that's a real easy type of array. So the polar array works very similarly. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this guy. I don't need this guy anymore. Come on. I think I exploded that. So, all right. So with a polar array, you got to recognize you're going to array this around a circle. Now, you don't need to draw a circle, but I'm going to array a circle. So I'm going to start out with a circle. I'm not worrying about the size of it. And I'm going to draw a line that's going to be from the quadrant. Let's see, from the quad point of that circle. And I want to go straight down, so I'm going to just hit the F8 key, and that's going to lock me into a mode that's going to let me just drag it. So I'm going to not worry about the length. I'm just going to drag it down, and then I'm going to hit enter. So what we're going to do is we're going to array this. Now, this end point of this line is going to be the center of a circle. And so if that's the case, this will be a nice array. But if you actually want the array point to be down here, you may have another object down there that you want to array with. So you have to be kind of careful how you draw things. So I'm going to go into a polar array, and I'm going to just simply select the objects that I've got here, and I'm going to hit enter. Let's see what happened now. Oh, it's asking me for a base point. So I need to give it a base point. I'm going to give it a base point at the end point of that, and there's my polar array. So now notice as I look at this, there are some settings. So you don't have rows and columns essentially, but you do have items. So the number of items, it says it's 6. So if I count this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, including the one you started with. So if I wanted to bounce that up, I could make that 10. And notice there's 10 options. And then you also have the angle between. So this would be the angle between that and that, it says is 36. And the angle to fill is 360. So what it's doing is filling it in a circle. So if I back that off to 180, notice what'll happen. It goes like that. Notice it's going 180 positive. It should go the other way if I type in negative 180. Sometimes it doesn't always do that. It didn't like that. Okay. So anyway, there's your numbers. So if I don't want that, let's say I don't want 10, I can back that off again to 6. And it'll change things up. So there's your polar array. It's not a whole lot to it other than that. We're going to be utilizing this to make little tree symbols. It makes a real nice array. Just start out with a couple of lines. I'll show you here in a minute how to do that. The other thing that they have is what's called rotate items. If you don't rotate items, watch what will happen. Notice how the lines stay parallel. Normally you would rotate items as they rotate or as they array. And once I get done with this array, I close it. Notice again, that's an array object. And they do have these grips, by the way. You can drag those to make your arrays bigger. You can do some things with them, or I can increase the angle by doing that kind of stuff. So you do have some of those, but normally you have more control if you come over here and do it by actually entering stuff. And again, just like we said before, this is one object. If you chose to explode it, you could. That would allow me to do things like maybe remove that object and remove that object. I couldn't do that as freely as if it was an array. So there might be some reasons to kind of do that kind of thing like there. There's your array. So I'm going to show you, we're going to create a little tree symbol. So I'm going to show you how I do trees. This is kind of a nice little mapping symbol. So I just start out with a line. I don't worry about it. I'm going to take myself out of ortho by hitting F8 again. That's going to be a branch. Then I'm going to do another branch that's going to kind of come off of that like this. And then I'm going to do another branch. It's going to kind of come off it like this. And then maybe one more. Okay, so there's what I'm going to array. Oops, I don't want that one. So what I'm going to do is go into my polar array, select my objects to array, give it a base point down here, and then just let it go. So that's really a quick little symbol that you might see in maps, but sometimes it's better if I beef that up a little bit. It gives me a little bit better look. That we're going to be doing something like this. Kind of looks, there you go. That looks kind of like a tree that you might see on a map. A lot of times I'll use a symbol like that. So these are really nice little tools. Great little tools, as a matter of fact. Okay. So that's the polar array. And again, he stays one object as long as you don't explode him. Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you one more here. I'm going to delete this guy. And this guy's called a path array. So path has to have a line or an object to follow. I'm going to use this thing called a spline. If you guys want to follow with me, you can just type in the word spline. And what this is, it's kind of a squiggly line. It's kind of like a P-line. It's a lot more complex than a P-line. I'm going to use that. And I'm going to just put a circle at the end point of this spline. I'm not going to worry about how big it is. And I'm going to do what's called a path array. So this object here is going to follow this path. So in this case, you select the object that you want to array, hit enter, and then you select the path curve, and there's your array. And it's really cool because you can go into this array and you can change the number of objects. So notice I can change things like that, or the distance between. In this case, let's say I wanted that to be 10. As the path curve itself moves, if I would take these grips and move it, notice how, that's why I say it kind of acts like a string of pearls. It kind of moves with it. These are, this is a newer array in AutoCAD. They haven't had this one out there all that long. And so we're not using it for anything, but that's kind of neat the way that works. So we are going to be utilizing most of these on this fifth assignment. This fifth assignment is going to be our last kind of mapping thing that we're going to be getting into. It's going to use arrays. It's going to have a lot of offsets, trims, extends, those kind of things, as well as layers. So hopefully you're getting the concept of layers and all of that. So that would wrap this lecture up for today. Pretty easy lecture, although these commands are going to be more the commands that you're going to be maybe a little tougher to use at first. So hopefully you're starting to get a concept of those other commands, and then this will bring this in. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and then see if there's any questions, and then I will go ahead and I will get this recorded or get this recording set and loaded up today. So let me pause the